Today we are talking about who is, in my opinion, the currently worst god in Smite. Now, before we start this, big disclaimer, this is my personal opinion. This won't be everyone's opinion. There's a different god for everyone that they just think is the worst, that they just feel like this guy's just not working right now or whatever. And depending on where you're playing, what level you're playing on, what your focus is, what mode you prefer, what god style you prefer, what class you prefer, that will always differ. This is just my personal take. Feel free to comment who you think is the worst god in the comments down below so that your opinion is heard too. Also, this focuses on PC conquest in different modes on different platforms and maybe a little bit different because some gods just perform differently there. With that out of the way, let's talk about what makes a god the worst god first, because there are a lot of contenders for this spot depending on how you want to look at it. I think there are some gods that could fulfill the role position of the worst god in certain situations, but don't really fulfill it otherwise. And I will give you an example here. Anubis. Anubis is a god that on a competitive level doesn't get picked because he is just not good for that. He's just too easy to fight when you have a coordinated team. He lacks the mobility to get away from anything coming his way, and everything kind of works against him. Plus, you know, his damage is somewhat easy to interrupt for the most part as well, or to just shut down. On other levels of play, Anubis can be absolutely devastating. If you look at low divisions especially, but even like mid-tier ranked, a good Anubis player can get very far because he doesn't get shut down that hard, and in situations where he doesn't get shut down, he is a force to be reckoned with. So based on that, it would be very hard to classify him as the worst god overall. And we also have the opposite situation, not so much at the moment anymore, but SLOTH is a god that has consistently been doing very poorly in non-competitive environments for a while now. He's been at the bottom of the rank scores for a long time and doesn't really climb up from there. But at the same time, in many competitive situations, SLOTH has been very, very strong in the past. Even when outside of competitive, he was not valued, simply because he works so well in the hands of somebody who can play him very well and somebody who has the setup and coordination with their team. So both sides kind of have their own position where they can say, this is not really a bad god in my eyes. And we have other examples of that. We have, for example, Amusen Cub, or we have Kali, or we have Nike even, who many think is the worst god, who actually statistically performs quite well and can be picked in certain competitive situations, even though as of late it hasn't been working out. So we need to find a god that's not being played competitively, not valued at all, or is just doing poorly, but also is not really a useful pickup in non-competitive. And there are at the moment 5 gods, I would say roughly, that fall into this category for different reasons. In this context, I could have easily made this a top 5 worst gods as well, but that's not really my goal here, because I think that wouldn't be doing justice to all the gods on this list, and you will see why, because not all of these are necessarily in a state where they would be among the worst in the future. One outlier that doesn't even make the top 5 anymore, in my opinion, is Xingqian, who probably could have made top 5 for a few people beforehand with his performance really not being very good, but who just got a massive amount of buffs that will probably drastically change his place in the meta, not just a little bit, and we kinda can gamble on that with relative certainty, so including him here would already be underrating him. And buffs are a common theme here. Multiple gods on this list have received buffs in the past and continue to receive buffs to kind of make them better, and sometimes it helps them and sometimes it doesn't. The first one that I want to mention here is Hades. Now Hades recently got a drastic buff to his ultimate, and he also got a buff to his movement speed at the same time. I don't think that Hades is necessarily good now. I've talked about this already in another video. I think he still has a lot of issues regarding his ability delay, regarding how little he can really do when his ult is down, and I generally think he's still not a strong pick in any situation. But I do believe that putting Hades among the worst isn't really fair, especially since we haven't really seen much of his potential since his buff, which I think is a very important distinction here. If a god received a buff that, for example, can change their place in competitive drastically, but we haven't seen them played in competitive since, it's kind of hard to tell where they stand, and I think that is the case for Hades. The next one is somewhat similar, and that is Arachne. Now with Arachne, I would say her buff is very different and doesn't necessarily feel super drastic with her current playstyle. What most people will be doing in the next patch will probably not immediately change when they play Arachne like they played it before, because then you're just using the ult to escape. But with Arachne, there's a good chance that new playstyles will come up, and I will talk about that in a future video, and new builds along with that, obviously. And with that, she has potential to be a lot better than she is right now if things work out. I briefly touched on this in the tier list with Emilzy, that I think there is potential for her to go up, and we'll have to see if it works out. It's not as straightforward as with Xingqian, but at the same time, I don't really want to say she's at the bottom of the barrel right now when she has this buff that can really change her. And that brings us down to the last three, and at this point we can kind of more speak about like the three worst gods, because these three are much closer together than the others are in terms of their performance, their stats, and everything really. There is still a bit of an order between them based on certain circumstances that I will address here, why I think they're not 100% in the same place. But if you say you think one of the others is worse than the worst one that I picked out, that's totally justifiable too. They're all somewhat around the similar area. And the first one here is the goddess of winged demonization. I won't say her name, but you know who it is. And the issue with her is that she just doesn't have much to offer for any team aside of objective secure at this point and some teamfight potential. But her ult is focused on healing, and anti-heal is highly valued at the moment. It also requires certain positioning from your team that makes you more vulnerable to other attacks from the enemy team as well. And there are a lot of other things surrounding her kit. Her early pressure isn't as good as it used to be anymore. Really, she doesn't have much going for her, and at the same time, a lot of other gods do the same job that she does easier. Emilzy recently pointed this out in the tier list as well, that if the game was more objective focused, then she would be valued higher, but because she is not valued as highly. But I think this point is something important, because the meta can shift in that regard very quickly, and with a meta shift, she would gain more value than the other gods on this list again, and I think that is why she's not quite the worst. At spot number 2, we have Cabrakan. Now Cabrakan is actually a god that still was played sometimes throughout the year in competitive, and that is true for the number 1 spot as well, just not very much. So we can safely say that even the worst gods in Smite still have some value in some situations. Cabrakan unfortunately doesn't have much value overall right now. He recently received a buff with a seismic crush cooldown going down, and even that didn't really change his position. He wasn't valued at Worlds. He's not really valued in Ranked or in Casual Conquest either, and that's about it. But Cabrakan has one important thing going for him. He has a very strong level 1 clear/pressure tool. And that may become very relevant very soon, because we'll have a new objective in solo lane coming in the next season, so next patch basically. And based on that, there's a good chance that he will be valued higher after that. Therefore, I will not give him the spot of the worst god right now, because I think there's still potential in the near future. And that finally brings us to, in my opinion, the worst god in Smite. And that is Bastet. The last time Bastet had a good performance was at Worlds last year, and that was pretty much exclusively by Scream/Reziel. And after that, she was hardly even picked. She was picked less than Cabrakan this season. And her ranked stats very much line up with that as well. She's the second least picked god in Diamond Plus in ranked after Nike, and the 6th least picked god in Platinum Plus. Sure, there are others that have sometimes worse win statistics, but when a god only gets picked by players that play her really, really well and value her at all in situations where she is good to pick, then you end up with a higher win rate. That's the old Arachne story basically. And even considering that, her win rate is not insanely high. Like Nike's win rate is higher all the time, for example. So we can kind of see why Hi-Rez is moving more towards pick rate over win rate for their balance right now. You can also see that her win rate increased by 7.79% since last patch, meaning that it's very unstable in her performance overall as well. And if we go down to Platinum Plus, we can kind of see this picture of her having a below 50% win rate along with the Goddess of Demonetization, while having a lower pick rate as well. So Bastet is just statistically underperforming. But why is that? One of the main reasons is that Bastet was designed to do one of two things: be a mid-game burster to some degree and fight off single targets relatively easily, especially if they're mobile. That has kind of worked in earlier days, but unfortunately guards in Smite became more and more mobile and more bursty guards were added, which both kind of take away from her position here. At the same time, she was an excellent split pusher, and that she no longer is. She's still okay at it, don't get me wrong. She's not a terrible split pusher, but not nearly as good as she used to be when her cats removed back their protections. She got buffs in return, like 5% damage increase on her passive, her cats giving her a physical power buff when they die, which is completely off the mark in my opinion, because normally you will use your cats later in your ability rotation and then the power doesn't help you much, or by the time that the cats are dead at least, there's a good chance that everything else is kind of done, and you also have to level the cats to even get the higher benefit of this, so really a weird buff. And now she got another buff which decreased the cooldown of Razor Whip by 2 seconds. Whoop-de-doo, that's really gonna change it when it starts at 15 seconds. So you can see that all of these changes are kinda not really hitting the spot for her. Additionally, Bastet's kit is incredibly telegraphed. You know when she jumps in, she's probably gonna use her 2-3 cats, whatever. You know where she will jump back to once she jumped in. And her 2 is such a slow animation that it's super easy to interrupt or just get out of the way before it even happens. Her ultimate still feels like one of the weakest in the game, being just cannon fodder in late game, and I'd really rather have a Bakasura ult over her ult, despite them somehow kind of doing the same thing. Now of course that doesn't mean that no one will ever have problems playing against Bastet, especially if you see a god very rarely, then playing against them is much harder because you won't know how to deal with them anymore. And that is really where Bastet's bigger issues are. Bastet is one of the easiest guards to counter in Smite. And if you know anything about countering, you can probably think of at least 3 ways from the top of your head. She is countered by Beat because you can get rid of her slow. She is countered by Heavenly Agility because you can get rid of her slow. She's countered by Winged Blade because you can get rid of her slow. She's countered by any form of Aegis because that way you can survive her burst combo, especially her 2, meaning that she will deal a lot less damage overall. She's also to some degree, I suppose, countered by Shell. As her 2 has bleed damage, you can even counter her with Thorns if you're a tank, though Heavenly Agility is usually the better choice. In a way, Bastet suffers from the same issues as similar assassins that are focused on slows like Bakasura or Nemesis that can easily be countered, but on top of that, her damage is also much easier to counter as it takes a while to actually come off, which is kind of counterintuitive for an assassin in the first place. I think Bastet needs a closer look at her in the future. It's not even that her damage is overwhelming anymore, for example. I think it would be very justifiable to speed up the entire animation of Razor Whip and maybe even the ticks. You could, for example, look at Susanoo, who's by far not a top tier guard, who on a Stormcutter has very similar output with a little less base damage but a lot more scaling to his name, and he can just spam that by hammering down on the button 3 times if you want to, or do even more damage by attack cancelling in between, whereas Bastet just gets this, well, ticking damage with the slow animation. The one could also have a look at it. For example, the Pounce return could kind of be modified in a way where maybe you have a certain radius into which you can pounce back instead of just exactly one place. There are a lot of things that can be done for Bastet without drastically changing her numbers, maybe even changing the cat mechanics entirely. There are a lot of cool things that could be tried out here as well. But I think Bastet will need something, because otherwise she's probably one of the guards that will also not benefit from upcoming metas, with even her clear not being exactly great. So she doesn't really have a niche. She's not an early ganker, she's not an early clear guard. What is she? Give her an identity, give her something to do now that she doesn't have the ult as a split pushing tool to the same degree anymore, and I think Bastet will be on a good way. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel free to smash that subscribe button. And also quick shout out to my current members: Kenny Olsen, Arawas, The Edgy Potatoes Edgy, Richard Thompson, Jado85, Xerbus, and Fro Double G Gaming. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.